So there's over 3,100 people who own $1 billion, and there is over 1 million people who own one full Bitcoin. We call them whole coiners. And as crazy as it sounds, today I'm going to be showing you the exact date of when it will be more rare to own one Bitcoin than to be a billionaire. And don't get me wrong, I get how crazy that sounds. Today, it is 33 times more rare to be a billionaire than it is to own one Bitcoin. But what everybody forgets is Bitcoin is very scarce. There's only 21 million coins, and as the number of billionaires gets bigger and bigger year after year, the number of addresses that hold one full Bitcoin, that seems to be declining. So let's get straight into extrapolating out when I expect this day to come, where owning one Bitcoin will be more rare than being a billionaire. To do this, we need to go all the way back to the year 2008. This was when Bitcoin was created. And what we're doing here on this chart is I've tracked the growth of the billionaires year after year, and we can see a very interesting trend. Naturally, the world is volatile. There are years like 2008 or 2009 when the number of billionaires decreases, okay? It's a recession, we get it. But then when we're in times of an economic expansion or a stock market boom, the number of billionaires grows a little bit quicker than the average. But when we use the average, what I've done is extrapolated out the growth of the billionaires into the next 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50 years. And yes, it's important to understand that this number is growing. Eventually, there will be more than 10,000 people who are a billionaire. Eventually, there'll be more than 50,000 billionaires. But it will always be rare to own $1 billion, okay? Today, just to visualize things, being a billionaire is literally like a 1 in 2.5 million probability. To kind of conceptualize this a little bit more, today there's over 25 countries that have less than 5 million people in their country. Okay, that's a big country. And again, if the number of billionaires were to be distributed equally across the world, of course, wealth is not distributed equally, but if it were, that means that in 25 countries, there might only be one billionaire in that whole country alone, surrounded by people who are, multi-millionaires or millionaires, and the list goes on. So again, it's incredibly rare to be a billionaire, and it will always be incredibly rare to be a billionaire, even when we do reach this magical little intersection point where it will be more rare to own one Bitcoin. Okay, so we've crunched the numbers and we've extrapolated out what we expect the number of billionaires to be throughout the next 100 years. And again, the fundamental reason driving the growth of billionaires is the fact that the global money supply will have to be expanded, okay? Governments all around the world have way too much debt. Their simple solution for that is to simply print a lot of money, devalue the money, and pay back their own debt with the devalued dollars. So we expect the number of billionaires to continue to increase and grow year after year, year after year. But this now gets us into the more interesting, the more speculative discussion of extrapolating what might happen to the number of whole coiners, the people who own one Bitcoin. Now, this is going to be a little bit more complicated, so stick with me to the end so it makes a lot of sense. But let's start this discussion of people who own one Bitcoin by looking at what happens to the addresses holding 10,000 Bitcoin and how this has changed over time. You guys can see that this peaked up pretty aggressively in the early days of Bitcoin, but this has been trending down, down, down year after year. And this has actually been trending down for 8 years now. And over the past 8 years, the number of addresses holding 10,000 Bitcoin has dropped from around 120 to somewhere in the 80s. Again, this number fluctuates. Different data sources have slightly different estimates, but that is about a 35% reduction in the number of addresses that hold 10,000 Bitcoin, and this has happened over the past 8 years. Again, keep those numbers in mind because they might look pretty similar to what's happened to the number of addresses who own 1,000 Bitcoin. We can see this actually peaked about 4 years after the number of addresses holding 10,000 Bitcoin peaks. So the number of addresses holding 10,000 coins, this peaked in 2017. Now the addresses holding 1,000 Bitcoin, this has actually peaked somewhere around 2020 to 2021. And since then, this has just been declining. And again, why is that? Well, every Bitcoin bull run, Bitcoin moves up an order of magnitude. So this makes a lot of sense when we think about things. So in the year 2016, 2017, Bitcoin's average price was really about $1,000. Then when we started getting into 2017 and 2018, all of a sudden, Bitcoin's average price jumped from about 1,000 to somewhere around 5 to 10,000. So it was a markup of about 5 to 10x. And when we crunch the numbers, the addresses holding 10,000 Bitcoin back in the year 2017, their net worth absolutely exploded. If you assume Bitcoin's average price was $10,000 during 2017, well, if you've got 10,000 Bitcoin in your address, that assumes you have a net worth of $100 million in one Bitcoin address. I think it's pretty natural that if your net worth has expanded by 10x and you've got 100 million big ones sat in the one address, you're naturally going to move your Bitcoin. You're naturally probably going to even sell a little bit of your Bitcoin. Again, I always remind you, never sell your Bitcoin. Borrow against it to dodge the taxes. And I think the best place to do that is with Firefish. So again, grab yourself a 30% discount on your first Firefish loan if you use the link down below. But again, let's talk about what happens next. What is the next address to actually peak forever? Because what's interesting is the number of addresses holding 10,000 Bitcoin, this peaked in 2017 and it's peaked forever by the looks of things. Now the number of addresses holding 1,000 Bitcoin looks like it peaked 4 years ago and it looked like it peaked forever. But since then, we haven't really seen any clear trend in the number of addresses holding 100 Bitcoin or 10 Bitcoin or 1 Bitcoin. Our base case here is that all of the bigger addresses, they will eventually start declining, okay? Again, you can't just have 1 million people holding an address with 10 Bitcoin in it. That's not going to happen because there's only 21 million coins. It would be incredibly unlikely that the number of people holding 1 Bitcoin were to hold on to half the supply. So our base case assumption is, okay, 96% of the Bitcoin supply has been mined now. During the first 16 years, when a lot of the early miners were able to accumulate 10,000 Bitcoin or 1,000 Bitcoin by just plugging in their computer and mining Bitcoin for a few days, this has kind of changed the game. Now it's exponentially more difficult to get your hands on 1,000 Bitcoin or 10,000 Bitcoin. I mean, Michael Saylor's the biggest holder of Bitcoin in the world nearly, and he's been buying Bitcoin flat out for 5 years, tapping billions of dollars off the public debt markets to do so. So it is obviously difficult to get your hands on 10,000 Bitcoin, which is why the base case assumption here is that these numbers will continue to decline. So if we're to extrapolate what's going to go on with the number of addresses holding 1 Bitcoin, what I want to do is I want to take an average. So we know that the number of addresses holding 10,000 Bitcoin dropped by about 35% in 8 years. And we know that the number of addresses holding 1,000 Bitcoin, since this peaked in 2021, this has gone down by about 20% over the past 4 years. So I thought, hey, again, this is just an extrapolation. Use your own numbers at home. But for today's purposes, I want to assume that the number of addresses holding 1 Bitcoin will peak in the year 2030, and it's going to decline by 25% every 4 years. And when we do that, we can find out when these two lines is going to intersect. And when we run the numbers, you might be a little bit surprised of just how early you could become a billionaire. Now, again, you guys can disagree with that 25% number all you like, but it's just what we're going to use for today's purposes. So we're going to assume that the number of people owning 1 Bitcoin, that will peak in 2030. Again, it's just a number I've pulled out of the rear end, so to say. And we're going to assume this number is going to decrease by 25% every 4 years. And when we do that, you're going to see that one day, pretty soon, not too far off into the future, as crazy as it sounds, the number of people holding one Bitcoin will decrease and shrink from 1 million to eventually being a number so low that it is more rare to be a full coiner holding one Bitcoin than it is to be a billionaire. But before we reveal exactly when that number comes, we need to make some quick caveats, because I know there's some people at home scratching their head saying, hang on a minute, Luke, 1 million people holding one Bitcoin seems a little bit low. And that is true, because we do know that there's 680 million people who have touched and bought anything in the realms of crypto. So there is about 680 million people owning crypto. But the big thing that most people miss is that these 680 million people are people who are using an exchange, okay? They do not own their own Bitcoin in their own custody like they should. Again, if you want to be a part of a very rare, a very exclusive club who will one day be more rare than a billionaire, you need to hold your own keys. Please do not hold Bitcoin on exchange. That's why I always encourage you guys to get your hands on some of these. These are hardware wallets. Highly recommend you get your hands on some hardware wallets. There's a ton of great options on the market. I love the touchscreen hardware wallets you can get from Ledger. They're also going to give you $10 of free Bitcoin if you use the link down below. And Trezor also makes a really great option, fully open source code base, Bitcoin only options. They're going to give you 5% off if you use a promo code Luke5. Again, this is absolutely crucial. We do a lot of videos on this channel talking about crazy hypothetical scenarios, but I always tell you, please turn my crazy videos off. Don't get bullish with me until you've actually taken control of your own Bitcoin. But when are these two numbers going to intersect? Let's have a look at it, because I think this is, again, the more speculative part of this video. But again, let's extrapolate this number out for today's purposes. So this, like the growth of the billionaires, this will not be an easily predictable decline in the number of people owning one Bitcoin. Again, it'll go up, it'll go down. When Bitcoin pumps aggressively, maybe this number will fall sharply. When Bitcoin's going sideways for a time, maybe the number of people owning one Bitcoin might uptick a little bit in the short term. But eventually, by the calculations I've ran, these two numbers will intersect by the year 2066. And it'll be at somewhere around 40,000 billionaires. And eventually, if this data continues, and if our assumption holds true that the number of people owning one Bitcoin decreases by 25% every single year, eventually the number of people holding one Bitcoin, it will also be in the 40,000s. So again, 2026 is when I expect these two numbers to intersect. And the reason why I actually kind of think these numbers are somewhat in the ballpark of reality is because when you look at Bitcoin's Pareto's principal distribution, you can see some very interesting similarities between the number of people holding one Bitcoin and the 80-20 wealth distribution we see in the world today. I actually filmed a deep dive on this topic recently. If you haven't seen just how many people, I believe, can hold 0.1 Bitcoin and 1 Bitcoin in the future, I ran all of those numbers, all of those calculations, and I even showed you just how much Bitcoin you need to be in the top 1%. I'm going to put a link to that video somewhere around there. With all that said, let me know what you thought of this one in the comments down below. I will see you all in the next one.